So in a way, focusing on the infrastructure itself might be useful, but in a way, we miss the data view and the most challenging things nowadays, which is discovering, using, anonymizing, but also what it was said before, all these algorithms that allow the processing for the purpose of consuming in a broader context this data. And please don't think that I'm crazy when I say this. I know what it means sharing sensitive data. So within the allowed borders. So what's the view on it, on this? For example, anonymization, discoverability of metadata, pushing out metadata from the TRE. Isn't it something that would, especially in the setting of an RTA, would be more kind of in-house?
So from my perspective, yes, absolutely. I mean, first of all, the bias on the technical questions is my background. I'm a technical person, I'm not a legal person, so I focus on that one. But if there is, I mean, the working group is open. We are defining what we want to do. And so it's basically up to us to decide what we might want to do. And secondly, the components that you mentioned in terms of anonymization, pseudonymization, I would see them as part of the architecture of such a TRE. So they are technical components with controls and everything in place. So yes, they should be part of it. Watermarking, fingerprinting, processing pipelines, whatever. So I would see them definitely as something we want to discuss as part of a process setup, architecture setup, tool setup, and so on. So there was 1, 2, and saw something over there. So we'll start here.
Ralf Müller-Pfefferkorn, TU Dresden, and from the German Human Genome Phenome Archive as a trusted environment. I think the technical aspect and the interface that you mentioned is a good point, but I think that's the second step. What I see from setting up this genome archive with human genome data, which is very sensitive data, is that the first step we took there was in setting up the processes that are all around these data, not necessarily the technical processes, but legal aspects, aspects of exchanging things, metadata, and the data. And when I think a step further in the idea of what is necessary to exchange data from such an trusted environment to other trusted environments or to other people, then I think we should think about what are, let's say, kind of standardized processes that have to start if I want to have some data, either manually or automatically,
So that's, I hope, what would come out from such a mapping of processes, identifying them and seeing how far we can align them. Let's call it alignment rather than standardization, because that makes it easier. So there was a person over here. Yes, and then there was...
Hi, I'm Jorik. I'm from SURF in the Netherlands, and I work together with Dans in a collaboration, Odyssey collaboration, in which we built social science infrastructure in the Netherlands. And part of what we do is actually building this process, what we've just been discussing. And I really like the way we're going now, because what we were actually thinking about, and I would love that to be a part of this working group, is to work on a set of managed access licenses, is what we call them. So that would be licenses that contain standard provisions that make it immediately clear to users that they have to process data in a VRE, for example, or that you have to meet certain conditions before you're actually allowed to use this data. And also from a fair perspective, we really want to have like a standardized way of describing access conditions for your data, because then as a user, when you're looking for data, you will immediately see that there's certain conditions to using the data, but you actually know before going through the entire application process that you are allowed to use the data or not. making the bar a bit lower to get actually access to this data. So I think that that would be really good if that would be a part of this working group.
Okay. Yep.
The workflow. And now we have already 2 different type of data, which are and workflows based on more or less the same thinking, but on genomic and on social data.
Sure.
So now we see that there are common
things,
workflows, which might be on totally different backend TREs, but the concept of how to solve this access.
Exactly, So we want to have blueprints and templates that then very necessarily will be implemented in different ways. So we will not prescribe how a TRE should implement them, but understanding the commonalities, or as you referred to before, the activities going on amongst the Nordic countries, bringing all of these together. I have a little bit of insight in what is happening in Europe, for example. I have no idea whatsoever what is going on in the rest of the world. And I'm sure there is things going on there as well. So especially if there is anybody in the audience from anywhere across the globe.
All right, I'm not in Europe. So yeah, my name's Lori Hack. I was former executive director of ORCID, currently a consultant. One of the things I'm thinking about is, and especially thinking about spinning up a new TRE, is what about a risk register? I think that is, it's like a format of saying, here's all the risks, legal, all the things you listed on the front page. You need to talk closer. Yeah, it's
louder.
Okay, louder. So yeah, so one of the things I'm thinking about is maybe what would fit in scope for this working group is putting together a risk register. This is a standard process folks go through for security of databases, but maybe it's something that you could use to combine all those components you had in the first page. And then you could also have, this is a military, this is a genomic, this is a this, here's the kind of access agreement, or we need an access agreement. So maybe that's like the first step to go through, and then could then help organize and hang the other information off of it. But that would be a really useful tool, that risk register template that any TRE could use. Maybe that's my thought.
Okay, thank you. I saw a hand raised somewhere and forgot it.
Yeah, so this is connection both with the risk management and data access agreements, because I'm coordinating support services for researchers, and we see that a lot of researchers who want to access data from SREs need to sign those data access agreements, and they are very, very different, and they pose different requirements on us as a university. And it would be of great value, I think, to align these data access agreements and perhaps in the future make them machine readable, so that we can automate processes and direct people to good secure environments locally that align with the data access agreements in the future, when things aren't totally manually processes, which it is today. So,
and data access agreements are also at the level of legal complexity. I think that it is doable or achievable within a working group, rather than, because it usually doesn't require changing any national laws and things like that we would usually run into. Anybody else? Yes, Carol. Oh.
So I'm a bit late. So I would like us to bring Health Data Research UK to the table. We've been developing the TRE blueprint, which is along with Healthy Cloud, which is a big EU project, where we're developing the 5 safes for being as a framework. Somebody mentioned about governance. Governance is absolutely critical. So it's how do you actually manage the governance framework, and also how do you manage the metadata in order to be able to drive the governance framework across the different services. And those blueprints are already sort of partly published out there. So there's quite a lot of work already being developed in this area. And so we would like to join your BOF or your working group to bring that work.
It's not my working group.
You're the one with the microphone at the front, Andreas. But I think it's important that we're very much aware of all these things that are already ongoing. Because somebody mentioned about blueprints, and there's already blueprints out there. It'd be good if we could kind of bring those together within this framework.
Absolutely, because within the working group, we can't do a lot of actual work. We have to build on the work that others have done and bringing that together, combining that, doing a bit of alignment. That would be the idea.
Thanks. Stephen Cackran from the Australian Data Archive in Australia, but also one of the co-chairs on the Sensitive Data Group. I think this point about the governance before the technology is really the critical experience, reflection that's here. The work we're doing in Australia, and say I've seen some of the UK work and so forth. I think it really ought to be the sort of the starting point for what the TREs are simply an implementation of the governance rules. But as I say, the technical is not the hard part. It's not. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm saying the social processes of the sharing, that are relevant there. The TRE is the implementation of those. So you need to find the rules of the game that are there. And the point being is that those national systems are developing, and international systems as well. There was a lot of work done. There was a Data Without Boundaries here in Europe for a period, and other places as well. So my sense would be to start with an audit. Start with what's already been done. The thing, so I'm running a national coordination project in Australia as well, with ARDC and others. And what we're finding, is terminology. Do we agree on what these things are? The legal frameworks that are there. Then instantiating the technical systems to comply with that. We actually have gotten to the point in Australia where we passed last year, actually a legislative framework which is going through an accreditation process, and so for TREs, safe settings, and so forth. And different countries and different regions will be doing different things. But knowing what's out there already, I say, because there are several initiatives going on, and coordinating that, I think would be a good starting point to then go, all right, so what is it we're trying to interoperate? Because if they're not consistent with the approach that's actually there, then say we're kind of we're doing the wrong thing first, fundamental.
I have one. I know that the technical parts are the easy ones. That's why I love to address them, chickening out from the really difficult problems. Because there was a few statements already on what we should start with. First, you need the organizational framework, then you need the policies and so on. So I agree, when establishing any TRE endeavor, that's the process you should follow. What we are doing here, we are not building a TRE. We're trying to understand how TREs operate. So we can, I think, go in parallel on taking a look at all the processes that are in place, taking a look at the architectures in place, taking a look at the tools in place, taking a look at the access regulations in place at the existing ones, collecting that information, aligning it in those silos. Obviously, I know that they're interrelated. Access regulations are interrelated to the governance frameworks and the legality. So I'm aware of these, intricate intertwinings. But I think we can start in parallel by bringing all the information that has been collected, that is being pulled together on a table, structure it, and then the next level, push it forward. So that's just on a quick comment on the sequence. Sorry.
Okay, hello, Jun Lau from NIST. So just speaking very generally, right? I think of these silos, they're there because I tend to think that this is maybe data that is intrinsically more valuable, right, than the other data, right? And so this is why we protect them. This is why we lock it away. And then I think that so for me, I think in starting to think about this problem, I like to think about like the worst case scenario to begin with. What happens if there's a data loss? I work for the U.S. government, and some years ago, we all received an email that says 22 million of you have had your data breached, and everybody knows where you live and your identities and everything, and so forth and so on. So I think in thinking about access and the structure, this cannot be decoupled from security and really the worst case scenario of what will happen if there's a catastrophic breach in this.
So worst case scenarios. Sorry, I'm trying to keep a sequence in mind, but
Hi, so I'm Thanasia Movenkol. I'm from the University of Oslo. So I come from the user perspective of someone who sits on highly sensitive data and has to operate with them on a daily basis. And I think it's incredibly important that we have good systems, and the architecture and the security should be there. But we should also not forget that at the end of the day, the researchers are also sitting inside these environments and are trying to do work. And sometimes a lot of the infrastructure here is very difficult to work with as a researcher, to the degree that I see users kind of stretch the stretch the boundaries of what they're allowed to take outside, because the environment is so hard. It is so it's such a big barrier for us to do our daily work. So I think it's really important when we're talking about this infrastructure that also a part of recommendations or whatever is focused on, but how does the researchers sit and work, and are they able to do their work in an efficient way? Because if they are not, they will be your data breach, not the security behind it, basically, not the technical part. So yeah.
It's a very good point. Yeah, thank you. So having this balance in place, is how to model that, how to provide guidance on that, because the ones responsible want utmost security. The best data is the one that's stuck down in the ground, not connected to anything, in a box, sealed, and nothing can happen, but nobody can use it. Yeah.
So yeah, hi, I'm Sandra Gesig from the Discovery Partners Institute at the University of Illinois in Chicago. And we didn't coordinate that because my topic is usability and virtual research environment, science gateways. And even that is what I wanted to say. With security, we don't have to forget that the humans are working with it. And if we make it too difficult, so we should from the beginning have really usability studies with it, not making, not going the step back in the 90s, 80s. We were like, oh, users have to learn it. They get a manual, they get, 2 steps through it. No, we have to build it so that it's intuitive. Besides the security and besides the human factor, we should also probably do something with community building, because we did something on surveys like finding out, when do you trust a virtual research environment, a trusted environment? And often they say, oh, when this group is using it, I trust it. They trust other researchers. So we need the focus groups saying, okay, and the avalanches to say, oh yeah, I trust this, and I tell that my community.
So having as part of the working group some activities on understanding what constitutes trust and how we drive it might be a good idea to include as an activity. Yeah.
I just got a comment from coming from Sweden. I see that there's a huge cultural difference compared to, for example, the US on what is considered sensitive, because as you said, it's a huge privacy breach. Everyone knows where you live. In Sweden, everyone knows where you live. It's public information. So there's a cultural, I think you should also do a cultural mapping here on what is labeled as sensitive data, which is hard but this is a great barrier of collaboration, because it creates distrust that if you don't consider this sensitive, we don't trust you to take care of it as sensitive data, and then vice versa. So
that's a very good point, because we have identifying sensitivity levels and so on, but understanding that they are culturally different, regionally very different. That's actually a good point, because that's why we will never agree on a classification of sensitivity levels basically across the globe, because the cultures are different and very likely should stay diverse as well. We don't want to the US into Sweden and the Sweden into the US. So having this as part of the mapping, I guess, will be absolutely essential. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. Thank you.
It's always great when someone brings up the point that you want to make before you make it. But essentially what I wanted to say, I am also from Sweden, working with sensitive data. And what I wanted to say that when I was talking earlier about common interfaces, it's easy to think that, oh, we're talking technical. We have to remember that a common interface here is not just technical. It is as much social and cultural. So when we develop a common interface, it's a matter of developing a common interface on the social and cultural aspects as well as on the technical aspects. So both are needed in order to actually make a TRE work, because a TRE is just as much, because it's about the trust, so it's just as much about the cultural and social aspect. And it's easy to kind of try to split these two, and I think that is where it becomes a problem. You kind of need to have them merged and think about them. When you're defining your common interface, you need to have the common interface of culture, the common interface of and that then will enable us to kind of work together more within these trusted environments. Because as silos, as we sit on our own little spaces, we already relatively well know how to do that. What we don't know how to do properly is share between each other. And there is where we need these added values. So that's sort of what I wanted to bring up.
Because it shows the complexity of what we're trying to achieve. But yeah, we have to face it and see what part of it we can fulfill in the first few steps that we can do within a working group. Absolutely. So have Ville, you, and then.
Yep. My name is Ville Tenhunen from EGI Foundation. And yes, I'm working also with the one theory in a LITI project where we have data from multiple countries and stored in one place, and then there is an environment to handle all the data and creating outputs and so on. So I have seen that, okay, these technical issues, they are not the hardest fight. Even if there is also a number of different things what to do, and the standardization with the APIs and these kind of things is something which we might a little bit think about. But in this project, when we have multiple countries involved, there is a legal issues, even if we are working in the Europe in one region, and we have some common regulations and so on. So I see if we're thinking about interoperability layers, these organizational legal things, they are quite hard, but when we are going a little bit wider perspective and multidisciplinary level, then there is a semantic things, and this might be quite hard. But it might be very, very useful to do some kind of recommendations on that level. And technical thing, it's a very good to know what we are thinking about these things. About this working group, I think that in my mind came that, okay, this kind of landscaping work is the first one, perhaps, that, okay, checking what we have, and then go to the fairness part, and perhaps making some recommendation on global level that, okay, what we can do for better fairness in the within and between theories and federations and so on, because this federative level is coming also.
The federation will be the ultimate goal to achieve, or interoperability wherever we can, as far as we can go.
And the global open research commons level, and it comes also to the picture and so on. I see that, okay, we need this kind of working group with these theories.
And we will see a continuity from very sensitive data that we are focusing on here, all the way to even public and open data. I mean, it's not a binary decision, open data or sensitive data. So we will see a continuum and understanding that a bit better, and see what we discuss here, which parts may be of relevance to even way less sensitive data. Might be very helpful as well, especially when we're talking about collaborating and working federated across different types of data, sensitive, non-sensitive, and so on. Before I hand over the mic, I just saw a few comments in the chat on, and we'll add these to the list of topics on threat models, and we of course already discussed different sensitivity levels, which was one of the comments raised in the chat window. So we'll pick up these, and yeah, if there's further questions online, or if you want to join in the discussion and share the microphone, please let us know.
Bob Hanisch from the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US. Just two general comments. One is I want to remind the group that RDA had a legal interoperability interest group. It wrote a quite extensive report on these issues. It's perhaps a bit dated. It was issued in 2016 already, but I put a link to that report into the notes
Excellent.
for today's meeting. The second is just a general comment about the FAIR principles, which do fully apply to sensitive and confidential data. The mantra, if you haven't heard it, is as open as possible, as restricted as necessary. And so I think we need to take that into account in any of our the recommendations that ensue. And the third thing is at NIST, we are beginning to deal extensively, not so much with sensitive data, but confidential data. Data subject to restrictions with particular parts of the private sector, private industry, in this case with the semiconductor industry. And a particular question I would pose to the group is, how do we deal with confidential data once it leaves our restricted space and goes to the consumer? What do we do to assure that that confidentiality remains intact, even if it's out of our immediate control? Are there techniques, are there methodologies for doing that? Maybe they're hash codes or something that have to be sent separately or whatever, but having some idea of the available technologies would be very useful.
So you think beyond hope and pray.
Right, beyond hope and pray.
Thanks also for pointing out the difference between sensitive and confidential data, because obviously we want to address both. I wasn't aware of the phrasing, so that's thank you.
Hi, Venkat here from OpenAir. This is more of a question, really, but the word certification, I wondered how that fits into this as well. Things like ISO certification. So, for example, I'm from Edinburgh, and the University of Edinburgh, they have a safe haven, which is ISO certified. I don't know if that fits into something that needs to be considered when thinking about alignments between different TREs, etc. It's a question more than anything.
Okay, I mean, I'm happy to hear any comments on that. Out of my gut, basically, certification with respect to existing ISO things and collecting those, yes. Certification from an RDA perspective, no big.
Look at what the certification means.
What kind of certifications are out there and which ones can be applied and what do they mean and which institutions actually have them and what is their experience with those certifications? What do they gain from it? What are the downsides of having a certification? Because there's also implications in that direction. I guess that would be a very valuable point to add. What I would not like to, or at least personally I would not like to see, is anything coming out trying from a working group to drive any new certification, or because first of all, it's not the RDA's mandate to do anything like that. Secondly, it's bound to fail, but that lesson learned. So if that's the focus of your question, I think this is a very valuable point to bring those lessons learned from the theories into the working group.
Richard Pitts from Oracle. My observation on that is that you'll find that data providers will want to drive the standards that they expect the cloud providers, if they're building TREs, and I'm building a TRE at the moment with a university in the UK. And what we've found is that, in this case, it's the NHS Blood and Transfusion Service is saying you have to meet these requirements, ISO standards. I fully agree with you. The TRE working group shouldn't drive what's required, but observe that. The other point I would make on personal data is it's great to hear that Sweden is that open. GDPR in the UK, HIPAA requirements in the US, and I'm sure Australia and other parts of the globe have their own standards as well, mean that you do need to find a set of common denominators for personal data, and then define how, depending on the level of what you're trying to do, where your TRE sits in that environment. The other aspect of it, which clinicians have brought up with me, is not necessarily just the observation of the data, blood pressure, temperature, this sort of thing. That sort of data is generally considered an important part of a TRE. Another aspect that clinicians have always raised with me is the general demeanor of the patient and having that data as part of the observed data that you may be applying into a TRE. And that caught me by surprise when we were building this one. So it's quite an interesting area. That's my 10 cents.
Thank you. Oops. See, I've been sitting all week long today. I get a little bit of physical exercise. This is fantastic.
Just a quick reflection on that and the comments I was making earlier. I think that's so the certification and accreditation. This is kind of what I was meaning about setting the rules of the game. Is it's driven by those who, custodians, the data providers, the regulatory frameworks. The TREs are then the means, through which that's implemented. So that alignment between the certification and whether you call it licensing or access requirements or regulation, that framework for understanding that, as say, in a sense, the legal content, legal interoperability, as I and looking at the different ways in which that's been achieved, I think that would be of real value because it's the specifics of the TRE that can depend upon, the implementation, but it's the compliance with the rule, the rules that have been set, which is kind of driving, that impetus. So that looking at that alignment and this, and I say that's, for example, what we're going through in Australia right now is which certifications are going to apply for which accreditation models? How do you align those with the specific, literally the data provider requirements that are there? That's, it's that compliance and the interaction of that compliance that's been part of it. So it's kind of two sides of the coin there.
Any further issues? Because I think, this was a fantastic brainstorm. So we've collected really a huge list of potential topics that we can address. The challenge now will be how to move forward from this list. And apart from obviously being able to extend it even further, what I would propose, Martin, you were taking notes, we will compile all of the input. I hope we captured everything. If we didn't, feel free to edit either directly in the document or send it to us and we'll edit into the document. But my proposed next steps would be that we, for each of the topics that we identified, that we describe whatever in 2-3 lines of what that question actually means, or what we would like to do in terms of collecting, mapping for standards and certificates, which standards exist or which certifications exist, ups and downs could be collected. And so come up with a list of potential activities. And then what I'd also like to collect is those things. So topics are interesting. And then if we know that there is certain questions where there is like 5-6 people interested and willing to drive that specific subtask, collecting that information, compiling it, and aggregating it, mapping, whatever, then we could actually identify a potential set of activities for the working group. Then we could, again, sit together and discuss whether we want to have 1 working group, 2 working groups, whatever. And we would also need a few names of people who would be interested in chairing, co-chairing, driving, moderating these activities. What I'd love to have is, apart from the obvious things like regional coverage and really not being too centered on one particular view of the field, is also get cross-domain coverage, because we will have very different aspects. And specifically, since we have a lot of focus on sensitive data, getting the other focus on confidential data, now that I learned that distinction. So industrial data and so on, that doesn't have privacy or GDPR regulations, but where the risk is purely in the IPR, commercial value and so on. To get those perspectives, because I think there will be a lot of alignment, but very specific questions where they differ. So if we can have volunteers who, there's lots of people in the sensitive data area, less so maybe, at least from the discussions we heard on the confidentiality area, pull those people in. Or if you happen to know somebody whom you can nudge to, don't just put their names there and then they shout at me when I contact them by email, but that you could nudge into being involved. This meeting is happening here in Europe, so we obviously have a very strong European bias for the audience here. The next meeting will be in Salzburg, which also happens to be in Europe. So I want to avoid that we reinforce that bias now that we are setting up the working group. It will be open anyway and people can join, but getting that input, especially for those colleagues here that are from Australia, the US. We haven't heard anybody from South America, Africa, Asia. Trying to pull in a bit more of those people so that we really have a comprehensive view. The idea would be, if we like that, we collect that information over the next 2 or 3 months. I don't think we will have a charter ready and submitted for the next RDA plenary. What we could aim for is having a charter that we discuss at the next plenary, doing another BOF session. Let's see how fast. I mean, if we are faster, I'm always happy. But setting the barrier low and then see how we progress. But I stop talking and hand over the microphone.
As we heard that there's interest in so many topics, for me this sounds more like we are going to set up an interest group on TREs and then spawn working groups from that. I don't know.
Yeah, chicken and egg. No. So would be a viable way. I'd like to do it the other way around. We spawn a number of working groups that then unite under an interest group or use one of the existing interest groups. We have the sensitive data interest. I mean, I'm not imposing us onto them, but if they are willing to have, that discussion across, there are so many groups in RDA. I would really only strive for creating a new one if there is an absolute need. So if the sensitive data people, you're one of the co-authors, you say, nope, don't talk to us. All those nasty people with, yeah. So that would be my preferred approach rather than establishing a new interest group, writing a charter for an interest group that does discussion and moderation and then spawning working. Would be my proposed approach, but happy to hear other opinions on that.
I think in this order, it could be interesting to have some liaison from the other groups just the way Françoise did for evaluation of the research. So
yep.
she brought many liaisons, and so it's easing a little bit here.
Absolutely. I mean, I assume most of us will be active in a number of different groups with the many different interests that we have. So I hope we can bring in those views, not just from RDA groups, but also all from all the regional and national initiatives. Because as I said, we can only collect, digest, and align. We can't create a lot of new stuff.
Yes, I have the impression that the way to go would be to establish a number of working groups. I think it could take the time it could take. I mean, we are not in a hurry. I have heard a lot of good input today, which open up for establishing several working groups, but also liaise with several activities, which has been already ongoing and has already delivered in the RDA. So in order not to do the same thing again, also in order to avoid the, so to say, the risk of yet another classification of data which is has not an like objective, but it's only subjected to this setting. In order to avoid a sterile list of TRDs, in order to avoid like the manual work which maybe has been done already, we could shape up this working group in very specific topic. For example, one thing I have gotten by listening, the TREs, how they are set up technically wise, it's of relevant interest to me. But they have a specific thing: is export not allowed, is allowed, under authorization is under control. There are a number of features that could be mapped. And the reason why I'm saying this is because that I believe that the TRDs that has been established in, for example, 2012, had an amount of technical feature, that were very much biased by the fact that it was at the very beginning of this journey. So it was really much protective at the time. And now things are getting a little bit more, so to say, we trust each other. The data controllers trust the data processor more. Technology has been developed in order to support the basis security process. So things are getting a little bit more aligned. So people are now using cloud. Might be that someone of our colleague in the other part of the ocean are using cloud. So not to technically describe the TREs, but map the trajectory over time of the functionality that these TREs has been selecting, so to say. This could be a number of activity which, so to say, give more shape to the working group. Sorry,
this is perfect. I was just taking notes on seeing how we can progress from what we were discussing now into deciding whether it's going to be one working group, 2, 5, whatever is a decision that we have to take later. And there is no rush. I agree with that. So what I would propose is that in the form that in the shared notes doc, we set up we collect the number of topics that were raised here. We then do. Somebody who is interested in the topic adds a description of the problem statement. So what should be solved? What should have gone away if the working group were to successfully complete that task? So whatever, collecting information on existing theories, that's done when we have a reasonably exhaustive list of whatever. So things like that, what is the problem? Then the activities that we could foresee, and I guess it's helpful to really spell out the activities that we plan to do, because that allows us to really get a solid judgment. Do we think this is actually viable and doable given the resources that we have? So what is it that we want to collect, align, given that fact that we have 18 months to 2 years, including the lead up time, and given the fact that we are all volunteers, knowing what projects we are involved in, knowing what initiatives we are involved in regionally, where we could actually draw information from and where we could actually get the resources to do so. Then we would collect a number of sources, so existing activities, projects, working groups, interest groups, national organizations and bodies that we could use as a source, because that we should not reinvent or define something completely from scratch, but we are here mostly for alignment ultimately. And then another item there on persons signing up who are willing and interested in that topic. Because I guess we will then include only those topics where we have a reasonable, solid number of people interested, not wanting to keep others from working on theirs, but knowing where to focus on what we should do. And if people could mark in some way, asterisks, brackets, whatever, whether they're interested in coordinating and leading, chairing their respective activity. Because it usually needs 1, 2, 3 persons who drive each specific subtopic that really care so much about it, or where it aligns so well with what they want to do anyway, that they would be willing to invest a reasonable amount of time pushing people to respond to emails, pulling things together and putting them on a slide deck and stuff like that to coordinate that. And once we have that document, I mean, I guess we can keep working on the Google Docs. We might spin off then second Google Docs following from that one afterwards, where we clean the information. As I said, I need to talk to RDA and see whether we can have a mailing list already for the BOF session, so that we can have an easier self-subscribe and self-unsubscribe if you decide that I don't want to be associated with that group of crazy people anymore. That we can use that. Until then, I would use the list of emails that we find on the sheet of paper and in the online notes document. And if you know of any colleagues that might be interested, let them know about it, pass on the pointer to the document, and then they should send us, Martin, me, an email so we can include them to the early communication until we have a proper mailing list with sign-up opportunities. Would that be a viable step forward? Yes, I see a few faces. I see a sufficient number of faces nodding that points to the fact that we might be able to launch at least one working group. Maybe more, depending on how we do. And then I guess we'll take the whole discussion from there and seeing who would be appropriate coordinators for the working group, chairing those and pushing forward then the case statement. We'll try to prepare a draft of a case statement and see where we take it from there. How much time do we still have? 7 past, so we still have quite a few minutes left. I just wanted to make sure that we address the next steps before people disappear. Anybody willing to help coordinate this? Yeah, 1, 2. That'd be great. Yeah, please. So contact me or mark your names in there, because we really need somebody to drive each of the topics to some degree so that we can push this forward. Any things that we should not do or that we should be worried about or that are scary and we should refrain from?
And maybe also a suggestion. So since you think that the next plenary might be too early, maybe have a combined working session with another interest group already existing that could fit, that you can have, instead of above or already a couple of topics combined with another topic could be a solution.
Yeah, I guess that's
virtual research environment.
Very happy. I mean, it will ultimately, so this joint session, it will ultimately depend on how much time we need to discuss our charter, because if we have a combined session with an interest group, that would likely take a lot away from the discussion time of the respective interest group. And again, we are in the startup phase, so we might need quite a bit of discussion on fine-tuning the phrasing, because terminology differs, so that we get really a solid statement that everybody agrees with. I'm happy to team up, because then it's not a BOF session, but it's a joint session, which sounds more professional already. But that will depend on the interest group. And what would be very interesting, if you know of interest groups that we should be in contact with, that we at least liaise with them and share that information so they can send it out via their mailing lists, which are already broader, more established, more global, so that we are sure we capture international input. So we have the sensitive data, we have the virtual research environments, we have, is that the legal interoperability, is that still an active interest group? Okay. So if you know of any relevant groups, or if you're a member of these, feel free to just pass on the information that we share here to them and invite them to contribute. And then we'll see whether it might even make sense to do one joint session across a number of those, just to inform and collect feedback without diluting the discussion, because the broader it gets, we need at some point to find the balance between breadth and depth that we want to address.
Among this coordination team, are there people only from Europe or also from other continents? Because that would be great value.
We definitely need people from.
So if someone volunteer for coordinating the initial statement,
absolutely. I mean, we can't submit any charter if it's just European. So we need to get over this local kind of bias that we have with the 2 meetings happening here. So anybody, the few individuals who are not from Europe in the audience, use this opportunity to, no, would be great if you could spread it. Yeah. As I said, I'm sure there is a lot of initiatives there. It's just that if you have personal contacts and let them know about this, it's better than a cold calling mass email. So if you could encourage those colleagues to join the discussion, agree and disagree. I mean, we are still shaping this whole thing. I mean, nothing is cast in stone. So that's a good moment in time, I think, where we can get this whole thing going. Any topics that we missed in the first round? Because I cut short the discussion at some point because I wanted to make sure we get the next steps aligned. Any topics that you think we're missing or that we should not address? Any non-goals beyond the ones that I had on the slide before? Anything that you think is everybody happy? Carol.
So I've been in and out. I was wondering about whether we should have a public PPIE aspect in this. Because, yeah, so we talked about researchers and their viewpoint, but what about the people who actually have the data? That is their data. So usually in Health Data Research UK or its offshoot Day UK, we've been doing these blueprints. We drive this through public and patient and public engagement. So there's always somebody who's from the public,
okay,
whose data it is that you are are circulating, that is the data that is sensitive, that is the data that is confidential, perhaps. So I was just wondering if there should be an aspect of that, or is that already covered by the sensitive data working group? Right. It might be interesting to have an angle because that is a very, very strong piece of the TRE program when it comes to health data, that there's always a patient component, advocate associated.
So we have, it's basically two stakeholder groups here, the patients for this medical data, the researchers that are working. So we need to get the, how do we call it? I mean, it's the stakeholder perspectives from those affected by it.
That's a better way of summarizing it, is,
Yeah. So I'm just wondering how we can get in such representatives involved in an RDA setting. Because they will likely, I mean, we are all patients in some way or other. So we are in RDA. We have lots of patients in RDA. Okay. So they are formally a member with. Okay. Okay. Involved in. Yep. Sorry. I get stereo coverage with two microphones and the rest of your.
I'm sorry, I only know the one that are French, to the Patients Association. So we are working with, so I can try to involve them. But it's only French, of course. It would be nice to have other countries involved as well, I think.
And we would need to find out what would be the equivalence of the patients for the other types of data that we have. So for military data, industrial data and things.
I just gave this example because the level of, how do you say that, shareability is important for the whole thing. Because there's some data you don't, as you said, you don't need to share. So the more you share, the more you need.
Sure, yeah. I mean, the hope would be to get as many of those stakeholders directly involved in the working group. In absence of this, we have to rely then on the TREs or those people who are working on research projects with those stakeholder groups to reflect or bring in the concerns that they are facing.
I know this doesn't help your Global South and so on, but I have now negotiated that the lead technologist from HDR UK DARE will help you set up the BOF, and it's his full-time job to do that. So
cool.
I'm
free.
Yeah. So his name's Rob Baxter, and his boss has just said yes. So I was doing something useful in the corner.
Excellent.
So you have your first volunteer from the Blueprint team.
Cool. Excellent. Thank you.
That's all right.
Now that we have a starting point, some people are already sharing the work, more volunteers will come up, I'm sure, because it's less work than for each individual.
So what I also see from our discussion now about stakeholders is that what we might need to establish as part of this working group is actually liaisons or contact people, because there are going to be many stakeholder groups involved. And if we try to bring in all of them, then we have more stakeholder representatives than we have people in the working group. It's going to be the effect, because that's such much. So probably what we'll need to do is figure out a way to generate within this kind of setting, this group, and I'm talking RDA as a whole, people who can act as liaisons or representations to the different stakeholders, so that they can come with input but don't get flooded with parts that don't concern them, and also on the other hand, so that we don't get flooded with that same thing. So I think that's one of the things that we should have in the added part of the what we should do is establish these liaisons persons or so what that can act as contact points for the different stakeholder groups around the world, because just within health data there's going to be hundreds of stakeholder groups, within secure data of national security. Again, we're talking, you know, as many stakeholder groups as there's countries, and so on and so forth. Industry, again, there is going to be a lot. So it's I think it's a good idea to try and figure out a structure where we generate some sort of task to people to be liaisons. I mean, for those stakeholder groups.
Yeah.
And then that would be the job of that person who's that liaison group persons would then be okay. In this step, we really need the input from the health group, for example. Okay, then we take them in, and then for this step, we need this group, and so on.
Yeah. So I was just thinking, picking up on Sandra's idea. So understanding what constitutes trust. That would be one of the things where we have trust from the researchers' side as the users of the theories, but also trust from those individuals or institutions or organizations that give data to a theory in order to make it available. And both of them need to trust that the whole complex system works. And so maybe involving them in a kind of trust study, if we're able to set up something, because that's a lot of work again. And it needs to be, so we need to make sure that we have somebody who has the resources to do that work as part of whatever ongoing projects or initiatives. But that would be an excellent way to involve those different groups and understand how trust differs, whether you're a patient, whether you are, whatever, a company providing commercially sensitive data. What kind of evidence would people like to see, given also the different levels of complexity that they can manage to digest, assuming that industry partners have whatever technical advisors and legal advisors in-house, whereas the usual patient doesn't come with the attorney and the financial manager to such meetings and agreeing to any standard data processing agreements. That would be fantastic.
In Germany, there's even a third group that is currently coming based on a large initiative with federal funding. A number of data trustee services are built up. So these are intermediates between data providers and data users. These are both domain-specific data trustees that are built up, but also general ones, that take data from either confidential from industry or sensitive ones from medicine, and they will play a role in the future in Germany.
I guess all over to some degree, similar structures will emerge.
Yeah, but as you mentioned before, what builds trust between provider and user? There will be something in between. So the trust will be on the data trustee from both sides. They have to trust the data trustee service that they either take care of the sensitive or confidential data and the sorry. yeah. So as a third party being involved,
which again is an organizational side. How such a theory is set up, whether it is the theory where it's a third party certifying and issuing certain trust aspects, because trust is ultimately a social construct that comes from a number of.
But I just wanted to emphasize, it's a different party than the provider and the user.
So one comment we have online is the question: Will this group also address structured mistrust issues, either between countries and or between traditional, non-traditional research communities? Such barrier also needs to be tackled in creating trust environments that promotes research collaboration across sectors, borders. Well, trust and mistrust, I guess we need to take a look, like security and breaches, errors being made. So I think taking a look at both sides of the coin and taking a look at actually at the adversary side. So mistrust, errors, breaches will usually help improve the other aspects. And I'll just see whether there's a second comment. No, somebody volunteered to be co-chair. That's good. We have a comment from Rita on my group in Indonesia is very interested on the sensitive data research data sharing and learning how other countries out of Indonesia. Very happy if we can join and learn from your group. Yes. Good. Anything else that I'm missing? What about developing criteria assessing the nature of and degree of sensitivity? Yep, we've got that covered. But anybody online, I guess they can speak, is it? They can unmute themselves. So feel free to just jump in. I don't see the list of participants here. So while we...
I was just curious to summarize my understanding of that foregoing conversation, which is that's kind of it's almost a research program essentially around what constitutes trust in different stakeholder groups fundamentally seems to be the orientation that's there. I'm just trying to summarize.
Yeah, so I would say within an RDA working group, we can't do a research program because we don't have any funding. But if we have a number of partners that have that question as part of any ongoing initiative project, then I think aligning across these on sharing whatever the same questionnaires or bringing in the data that we have collected on feedback from different communities. So I know that we at home, we are running one such activity at the moment. We're trying to understand trust in certain open information spaces, open source software, data, knowledge platforms, and so on. So again, not directly that question, but we could bring that expertise in, align it, and rerun similar studies elsewhere. So if there is, and that's why I guess we need the question, the problem, the methods, what we want to do, and then the names. And if there is sufficient list of names there, then I think it's worth trying and seeing what we can come up with. Again, any solution that we come up with will never be a final verdict on, this is trust, this is non-trust things. But I guess sharing that information and helping institutions to improve their operations by moving in certain directions or adopting certain communication principles or certain transparency levels, I guess would be something that I would at least consider useful from my perspective. Any other final comments, words, statements, online or in presence? Are people happy? Are people hungry to go for lunch? We can go to lunch 6 minutes early and beat the queues. Thanks so much for joining, and we'll be in contact. Thank you. I guess there is nothing on the next slide. Yeah, I discussed it. We'll share it. That's fine.
Hi,
Hi.
Francesca.
Sorry. Hi.
Hi.